The United States was founded as a white supremacist slave state. Through discriminatory laws, exclusionary policy, and pseudoscience, the United States created modern racism. Form of racism that attempts to be cunning and at times even inviting. Racism in America hasn't disappeared, it's just changed form. Historical figures like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X talked about the deceitfulness of the white liberal, who through feigning concerns over tactics decides the Black liberation movement is not a worthy cause. The book Black Power, The Politics of Liberation takes this idea much further. It's also the origin of the term institutional racism. It'll probably never be read in an American high school, and that's why it's important that you read it or at least understand why it's so important. Hey everyone, I'm Chris, this is Chris Runs This, and today we're talking about Black Power, The Politics of Liberation by Kwame, Ture, and Charles V. Hamilton. I'm sure you could already tell, but I'm not black. Because of that, my perspective on this book is clearly of one of an outsider. Ture actually talks about this kind of thing in the book, and I'll get to that later, but for now I want to make it clear I don't attempt to be a kind of representative for anyone aside from myself, and I'm just trying to spread this out to my own community in the way that Ture suggests. Without further ado, let's go. So first, a little bit of background. In 1978, Stokely Carmichael changed his name to Kwame Ture in honor of Ghanaian President Kwame Nkrumah and Guinean President Ahmed Sékou Touré. According to his friends, Ture didn't really care which name he used, so all used them interchangeably. Now, over a decade before that change, in 1967, Kwame Ture, revolutionary socialist and civil rights activist, teamed up with Charles V. Hamilton, a Columbia University political scientist and civil rights leader, to write this book, The Definitive Guide to the Black Power Movement, and an utter beatdown of the white liberal. These two lay out their experience in organizing political movements and put down a serious plan for revolutionary activism. The data in this book is out of date, obviously it's from the 60s, but the information in it is just as relevant, if not more relevant than ever. Before I get into the title of this section, there's one thing I need to address that's already come up a few times: white liberalism. White liberalism is a subject that comes up a lot throughout this book, but right now it's just important that you understand that white liberalism is a mentality that can infiltrate any group, sitting back and critiquing tactics instead of adding to the movement. The truth is that white liberalism isn't just liberals, it's rational centrists, the apolitical, the not openly racist. It's not even just white people. Non-black, non-white people can also be white liberals, or at least express their ideas. One of the biggest complaints I've heard from the modern black liberation movement is that people tend to group together POC and BIPOC, even though many non-black, non-white groups have a history of anti-blackness. As an indigenous Hispanic person, I wish this wasn't true, but it simply is, and we have to acknowledge that this feeds into white supremacy. So what does black power mean? Well, obviously there isn't just one definition, but Ture does say this: when black people lack a majority, black power means representation and sharing of control. It means the creation of power bases of strength from which black people can press to change local or nationwide patterns of oppression, instead of from weakness. It does not mean merely putting black faces into office. Black visibility is not black power. Most of the black politicians around the country today are not examples of black power. Here, my fellow non-black people, is where we sit back and shut up. It doesn't actually matter if you read Ture or you like Angela Davis. If you're not black, it's not your place to combat these black leaders. Don't insult Candace Owens' blackness for her conservatism. This should be obvious. I shouldn't have to explain this. Doesn't matter how woke you are, if you call a black person Uncle Tom, you're being racist. Now, while talking about representation, Ture talks about the need for organizations led by black people. This is because Ture and Hamilton both agree that while the black experience is not monolithic, it's necessary to fully understand black liberation and why it's so important to black people right now. When people say things like this, there's always going to be someone who says reverse racism or black supremacy, segregation. Ture and Hamilton directly address this in the book. This is a deliberate and absurd lie. There is no analogy by any stretch of definition or imagination between the advocates of black power and white racists. Racism is not merely exclusion on the basis of race, but exclusion for the purpose of subjugating or maintaining subjugation. The goal of racists is to keep black people on the bottom, arbitrarily and dictatorially, as they have done in this country for over 300 years. The goal of black self-determination and black self-identity, black power, is full participation in the decision-making process affecting the lives of black people and recognition of the virtues in themselves as black people. Black people of this country have not lynched whites, bombed their churches, murdered their children, and manipulated laws and institutions to to maintain oppression? White racists have. Congressional laws, one after another, have not been necessary to stop black people from oppressing others and denying others the full enjoyment of their rights. White racists have made such laws necessary. The goal of black power is positive and functional to a free and viable society. No white racist can make this claim. It's almost so obvious it shouldn't need to be said. Black people in this country have the right to demand freedom and equal treatment in society. There is no debate to be had, and be clear that there is a correct side, and that is for the Black Power movement. This book starts out by plainly stating that black people in America should unite and demand huge structural change without being afraid of being called militant or divisive. They write, "Black people in America have no time to play nice, polite parlor games, especially when the lives of their children are at stake. Some white Americans can afford to speak softly, tread lightly, employ the soft sell, and put off. They own society. For black people to adopt their methods of relieving our oppression is ludicrous. We black people must respond in our own way, on our own terms, in a manner which fits our temperaments. The definitions of ourselves, the roles we pursue, the goals we seek are our responsibility." Ture and Hamilton both believe that white liberals are incapable of criticizing themselves and the systems they've created, and that because of that, it's black people's responsibility to educate white people and force them to change the system. The authors denounce the common platitudes of white liberalism. Granted, things were bad, but we are making progress. Granted, your demands are legitimate, but we cannot move hastily. Stable societies are best built slowly. Be careful that you do not anger or alienate your white allies. Remember, after all, you are only 10% of the population. We reject this language and these views, whether expressed by black or white. We leave them to others to mouth because we do not feel this rhetoric is either relevant or useful. The exact same thing you see today was happening back then. Conservatives and liberals can't wait to go on TV and condemn black people for protesting the unceasing attempt to destroy them. Decades later, and the exact same arguments are happening. How's that for innovation under capitalism? But maybe I spoke too soon, because there was something that was at least coined in capitalism, and it was in this book as well. It's institutional racism. Yes, very underrated fact, institutional racism was first talked about in this book by Kwame Ture and Charles Hamilton. When a black family moves into a home in a white neighborhood and is stoned, burned, or rooted out, they are victims of an overt act of individual racism, which many people will condemn, at least in words. But it is institutional racism that keeps black people locked in dilapidated slum tenements, subject to the daily prey of exploitative slumlords, merchants, loan sharks, and discriminatory real estate agents. Society either pretends that it does not know of this latter situation, or is in fact incapable of doing anything meaningful about it. Just because society doesn't make the meaningful changes that we want for the black liberation movement doesn't mean that they're not responding to the movement. They're just responding in the wrong way. Charles Silberman wrote in Crisis in Black and White, "The tragedy of race relations in the United States is that there is no American dilemma. White Americans are not torn and tortured by the conflict between their devotion to their American creed and their actual behavior. They are upset by the current state of race relations, to be sure, but what troubles them is not the justice that is being denied, but that their peace is being shattered and their business interrupted." Isn't this exactly what we see today? Condemnations of protests and riots as counterproductive, and a call to go back to normal when what is normal is what got us here and what is normal is wrong. This inevitably leads us to discussion of the Democratic Party. Here the authors bring up the biggest divide between the Democrats and the black liberation movement: capitulation to white America and saving face. They claim white people are too interested in their current state of being. They claim that white people that want to support their movement tend to side with the opposition when their demands aren't fully met. In the book, it's made clear. Jobs will have to be sacrificed, positions of prestige and status given up, favors forfeited. It may well be, and we think it is, that leadership and security are basically incompatible. When one forcefully challenges the racist system, one cannot at the same time expect that system to reward him or to treat him comfortably. Political leadership which pacifies and stifles its voice, then rationalizes this on the grounds of gaining something for my people, is at bottom gaining only meaningless token rewards that an affluent society is perfectly willing to give. That last line really digs into the idea of the black leader. Those who have read the autobiography of Malcolm X will know what I'm talking about. These so-called empty vessels for white politics. Revolutionary leaders of the time knew that the Democratic Party didn't have their best interests at heart and that they would try to use black people to get votes without truly caring about their needs. They claim that these black leaders are used by white politicians to stifle the black liberation movement. Those handpicked leaders have no viable constituency for which they can speak and act. All this is a classic formula of colonial co-optation. Ture and Hamilton both agree that black people's support for the Democratic Party should be strategic and never unwavering. The authors authors go on to describe the history of black people in America through the framework of colonialism and alienation. They talk about how the economic situation of black people today is similar to that of a colonial relationship. Black people are subordinate to power structures created and run by white people. White people and white structures that did in the past and continue to deny black people equal treatment in society. When some people compare the black American to other immigrant groups in this country, they overlook the fact that slavery was peculiar to black people. No other minority group in this country has ever been treated as legal property. This is where I repeat myself for emphasis. The language of the Black Liberation Movement is exclusive for black people. While indigenous history is vast and horrific, white supremacy in the United States was specifically focused around the subjugation and domination over black people. It's very important that we understand this as to not co-opt this kind of language. Liberation as a concept is necessary for tons of different subjects and groups, but black liberation is something we need to be aware of and respectful of. And to co-opt a movement that's all about ending colonialism would be terribly ironic. Hearing these words, some people take this as hate for white people. It's not uncommon for our history to demonize revolutionaries in order to make them look like criminals and discredit them. How many of you learned that Malcolm X simply hated white people and was like evil Martin Luther King? I know I did. Well, that's not the case. Ture and Hamilton don't hate white people. They hate racism, racists, and the racist structures that they created and profit off of to this day. Their words are forceful and militant because they have to be if they want to be heard, not because you should feel bad or apologize or feel guilty for being white. The authors never say anything like that. What they do suggest is that integration is a two-way street, and that up until now, white Americans have refused to actually do their part in integration. From the book Racial Crisis in America, for a lasting solution, the meaning of American must lose its implicit racial modifier, white. Even without biological amalgamation, integration requires sincere acceptance by all Americans that it is just as good to be a black American as it is to be a white American. Now, while the authors don't hate white people, they do lay out some history that makes you think it would make sense if they did. White people, and specifically white Americans, have historically demonized cultures that they've deemed inferior to their own. The indigenous are called savages, the Semitic are shifty, black people are lazy. These are all lies created by racists to justify their crimes. These are not invading forces, foreign species, or existential threats to society. They are merely people that want to be free. The United States primes its citizens to accept these lies. From public education to public transport, white supremacy runs deep. Ture mentions that people don't grow up questioning phrases like home of the brave and land of the free, so when you grow up you don't question things like fighting communist aggression or that we really are a great society. This country has done whatever it can to hide its true intentions, to profit, to exploit, and to see genocide not as an atrocity but as a tool that ought to be used, and it's your job to identify it and not fall for it. During the 1960s, Kwame Ture led the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, dedicated to organizing student sit-ins during the Civil Rights Movement, one of the pivotal ways in which black youth and children participated in the Civil Rights Movement just as their counterparts did. In the book, Ture also talks about his experience working with the Mississippi Freedom Democrat Party, and the challenges that he faced trying to spread a liberation movement in the South. Things like getting poor people to support a movement that was openly against the people that they worked for, still in a way rightfully fearful of their future. Ture also talks about building coalitions and one of the biggest problems, putting in the work. When talking about people who originally wanted to be political organizers for the Civil Rights Movement, he says, in fact, many people who would aspire to the role of organizer drop off simply because they do not have the energy, the stamina to knock on doors day after day. That is why one finds many such people sitting in coffee shops talking and theorizing instead of organizing. So what now? A question many people interested in radical politics find themselves asking. To Ture and Hamilton, the answer is complicated but simple at the same time. It's organizing. Creating parallel structures to the government in which black people can liberate themselves through gaining real power in society. Something like the MFDP, a political party that has clear goals for black people and black liberation, or something like the SNCC that organizes protests. For an outside comparison, look at how the Black Panthers legally carried weapons to put checks on California police. The people leading these movements need to be the ones who aren't afraid of changing the status quo. But of course, not everyone can start a political party, so what can you individually do? One thing is mutual aid in your own community, providing people with their basic household goods, hosting or volunteering at a food drive, supporting black creators, and more importantly, educating the people in your own community. Ture and Hamilton suggest that white and non-black people who are interested in black liberation should not invade black spaces, but instead instead try to spread their knowledge in their own communities. Something that intuitively just makes a lot of sense. These things may cost you time and even money. You won't get paid, and you might even get backlash for spreading these ideas. And if you sincerely hold these beliefs and stand up for them, you might even put yourself in danger. After all, it may well be, and we think it is, that leadership and security are basically incompatible. I repeat that sentence because it's one of the most important themes in this book. Liberation politics is not the place to have comfortable conversations. While this book has clear anti-capitalist themes, they avoid talking about socialism and communism specifically to exemplify how important black liberation is to America right now. But be very clear, Kwame Ture was an avowed Marxist-Leninist and a revolutionary socialist. This book is not that long, extremely important, a great read, and should be required for everybody in the leftist movement. If not to read, but at least to fully understand and appreciate. That was Black Power, the Politics of Liberation. Thank you all, and I'll see you next time.